Thoma is the 37th Pyro Polearm character in Genshin Impact, and even though he's one of many characters of his archetype, he provides a unique utility that other characters in the game haven't been able to yet. However, he can be confusing to build due to his need for so many different stats, so today in this guide I want to tell you guys how to build him most effectively, what weapons to use, what teams he can be good in, and show you guys a Spiral Abyss showcase, and overall give a character review at the end of the video. With all that being said, let's talk about his kit. So I just mentioned that Thoma provides a unique kit, and that's because he does. He provides shield over time, which guarantees the possibility of shield for the whole duration of his burst. Currently, all other shield units in the game have a fixed duration or health pool, and if the health runs out, you're kind of just dead. Whereas with Thoma's shield, it will last the full duration, unless he dies. The shields are a bit easier to crack, but overall, the utility of a refreshing shield, in my opinion, is pretty cool, and as much as people don't want to give Thoma credit for being an actually good new unit, I think he's pretty neat. Thoma's elemental skill will activate a shield that has fairly low health even if you invest into him full HP. While his shield is weak though, the point of his skill is to generate energy. Thoma generates 3 to 4 particles per elemental skill use, which isn't a lot considering he has an 80 cost burst, but when we get to weapons and teams we can talk about how to fix that to some extent. For now, it just does damage and gives a small shield. The shield will last a total of 8 seconds without being refreshed, and his skills have a 15-second cooldown that can be turned to a 12-second cooldown with Constellation 1. His elemental burst is the best part about his kit though, where he can deal AoE pyro damage in a cone in front of him and give himself a shield. The shield is pretty special though, because for every AoE pyro he throws out, which will be once a second max, but only triggering on normal attacks, he will gain a new shield. Now, a new shield isn't a big deal if it's low HP, because enemies can still one-shot it. However, this shield will stack on top of the previous shield and gain a total of the previous shield's HP. It can only stack to Thoma's max HP, however, once you hit the 12k-ish threshold, you should be mostly in the clear for not taking damage to a hit, and for things like Ruined Sentinels that deal damage over time, having Thoma's shield refresh once a second is pretty dang solid. His shield will last 8 seconds this way, but when the shield refreshes, the 8-second timer resets, which means between bursts you can keep 100% shield uptime. This skill has a 20-second cooldown, but can be turned to 17 seconds with Constellation 1. One thing to note about Thoma is that he has a 2.5-second internal cooldown, meaning that he can only react once every 2.5 seconds or once every third hit from his burst. Most of the time, Thoma's going to be triggering reactions as a result. While we're on the topic of his elemental burst, neither his skill or burst snapshot in Bennett's burst, so his synergy with Bennett isn't as great as Xiangling's. When you're using Thoma's elemental burst, the best thing you can do is use his elemental skill and quickly use his burst right after before you pick up the particles, so that way his newly generated particles can be added to his energy bank. Thoma's first passive talent increases shield strength by 5% whenever a character refreshes one of his shields. This effect can stack up to a total of 25%, and each stack lasts for 6 seconds. So if you keep refreshing his shield and then you activate his elemental skill during the downtime of his elemental burst, you can keep these stacks up forever. His second passive helps him to have less split scaling issues, where it increases his damage done with his pyro AoE hits by 2.2% of his max HP. This means that you can run HP artifacts on him and still output some damage. A lot of people are going to sleep on building Thoma for any damage at all because it looks very small, but I'll talk about why that's not entirely true when we get to the misconception section. Before we go over weapons and builds, I want to talk about Thoma's constellations because it will affect the build that you're using. This section is actually very important, especially if you do end up pulling constellations on Thoma, because Thoma's constellations are insanely good value. First off, his Constellation 1 knocks 3 seconds off his skill or burst whenever an enemy attacks his shield. This will essentially let you battery a character with Shimenawa 3 seconds sooner, or it'll let you battery Thoma 3 seconds sooner, which is really important for Thoma because he has a lot of battery issues. When you get to Constellation 2 though, it increases his elemental burst duration by 3 seconds, which puts it at 18 seconds of length. That's 3 more procs of his barrier and his pyro AoE. Overall, it increases the damage output that Thoma has, and it allows you to have 100% uptime on his elemental burst if you have the energy recharge to support it. Constellation 3 increases his elemental skill level by 3, and Constellation 4 is insanely good. It restores 15 energy to Thoma after he uses his elemental burst, which makes his burst only cost 65 energy instead of 80. If you get C4, he still has energy problems, but they're not nearly as bad, and you can build less energy recharge, which we'll talk about later. His Constellation 5 increases burst level by 3, and his C6 is essentially Geo-Resonance, but only for basic attacks. Whenever Thoma's shield refreshes, normal, charged, and plunging attacks get a 15% damage buff for 6 seconds. During his burst, this effect will basically always be active because you're constantly resetting his shield, and it's a really valuable constellation. With that being said, I don't think that Thoma is unplayable at C0. I think he's actually more than playable. I think his shield provides a lot of good value, but his constellations definitely contribute a ton to his kit and make him a much better character. I'm not going to suggest you pull on Hu Tao banner if you already have Hu Tao or if you have a guarantee, but if you don't have a guarantee and you're thinking about it, if you really like Thoma and you want to get some constellations, I definitely think they're worth it. His best constellation for me, hands down, is C4, followed by C6, and C1 and 2 after, but they're all very good. So now I want to move on to a weapon list. And if you watch any of my other guides, you know that weapons don't usually come until after the build, but I feel like it's important important to put weapons first here because Thoma is very complex. So as mentioned before, Thoma has a lot of battery issues, so weapons and artifacts are super important. Typically, you won't be running Thoma with a pyro battery, you're going to want energy recharge on a weapon. No, Staff of Thoma isn't dead, but if you're looking for the best options to always have your burst up, using a weapon with energy recharge or particle generation will be your best option a lot of the time. And funny enough, I found that Engulfing Lightning was generally more useful to me than Staff of Thoma for its passive that gave Thoma more attack to increase his damage and gaining energy recharge after casting his burst. Of course, that weapon is married to Raiden, so we're left with the next best option if you don't have it, which is going to be Favonius Lance. And Favonius Lance is best in slot for free-to-play or low spenders, and in some cases even better than Engulfing Lightning because of its passive. It has a chance to generate white particles on crit, which massively helps battery Thoma, or can be used to give 15 energy to your pyro carry with Shimenawa like Hutao or Yoimiya. I cannot undersell the value of this weapon on Thoma. It is incredibly solid. With there being no sacrificial polearm, this is your best free-to-play or low spender option, and in cases where you don't have very good energy recharge substats, it will even be better than Engulfing Lightning. I would even take Favonius over the Catch or Skyward Spine in the same circumstances because the energy particles that it generates when you crit help you so much. It's the closest thing we're going to get to sacrificial polearm. The Catch, however, is an amazing weapon that perfectly synergizes with Emblem of Severed Fate. My problem with the Catch on Thoma is that the other characters that can use the Catch well, such as Xiangling and Raiden, are usually in high demand and you can only have one of the Catch. So if you're using Xiangling or Raiden already and you don't have alternatives for them, I wouldn't actually give the Catch to Thoma because it just gets more value on Xiangling or Raiden. If neither of those two characters are using the Catch though, I highly recommend it after Favonius. For craftables, you can craft Kitang Cross Spear or Prototype Star Glitter. Kitang Cross is actually decent in an Electro Aura team, like for example with a team Official or Beto, because its main stat is Elemental Mastery. Because of Thoma's 2.5 second ICD, he's going to be proccing reactions a lot of the time. Generally speaking though, Star Glitter will be a bit better because of its energy recharge main stat that synergizes with Emblem of Severed Fate and helps you get more energy out of particles. All of that being said though, I still highly suggest you use Favonius Spear if you don't have Engulfing Lightning because shield uptime is much more important than damage overall. In the rare circumstance where you don't need an energy focused weapon, like if you have Constellation 4 and high energy recharge substats on your artifacts, your best weapon option is obviously Staff of Thoma because it gives him extra HP which helps him get a stronger shield and damage, and on top of that it's a crit damage main stat. If you don't need the ER, give him Thoma. It's literally in his name. Otherwise, standard DPS weapon rules apply where crit is really valuable, and as a result, some of your best choices for the weapons are Jade Spear, Deathmatch, and Blackcliff. The new Wavebreaker's Fin is pretty solid for getting damage on Thoma as well because of its passive that gives burst damage based on energy cost across the whole team. Wavebreaker just in general could be a bit harder to build because it's not a crit main stat, but it will be okay to give him regardless, so if you did get that from the weapon banner, you can go for it. And lastly, if you're building him as a shield bot, Black Tassel has an HP main stat and can help with that, but if you're going for a shield bot, energy recharge will be more important than HP to make sure his shield can be up as often as possible. Those are all the weapons that work on Thoma fairly well, but of course the one that you use will depend on a ton of different factors since he needs HP and ER to function, while also wanting to put out some damage in an optimized team. So if you do need to go back and rewatch, there are timestamps in the video and you can go click through this section. So I don't usually include sections like this where I talk about misconceptions about characters, but I feel like it's incredibly important to talk about with Thoma. The first misconception I want to address is that Thoma doesn't do damage. You might be thinking, Brax 3k damage per second is not a lot, and you're right, it's not. But I have seen many content creators and players make the same mistake over and over of thinking that Thoma is bad because of only hitting between 2 and 6k damage per second. There are two main things that people don't consider with Thoma's main damage output, and that is first, that Thoma's damage is AoE, and that the area that he hits is fairly large. He can hit enemies in Venti Lift, and most of the time your carry will be facing a group of enemies. With only 3 enemies, you could be getting an extra 6 to 18k damage per second on your team, even if each enemy isn't taking the full amount. To give you something to compare that to, the new Spiral Abyss 12-3 takes 35,000 damage per second in total across the 3 enemies in order to get a clear. The second thing that people aren't considering is that Thoma gets this damage for free. Currently in the game, there are no other off-field DPS shield units in the game other than Zhongli, C1 Beto, and C2 Kaya. Diona doesn't focus on damage, though can be a carry but doesn't do it off-field. Yanfei can shield, but she's a carry unless you're running Shield Fei, which is kind of a meme. Zhongli off-field damage isn't super high, and in a lot of teams using his Meteor can actually be a DPS loss. Thoma's damage comes out even if the shield is broken. His damage is absolutely free, and while he's nowhere close to Xiangling, he ends up being a decent unit just on the premise of him giving your team a bit of extra damage just from being a support. You can build him shield bot, but he can also do damage if you invest right. I figured there's going to be a lot of questions in my comment section about these 4 sets, so I just want to talk about it before I give you the easiest build for him. The first thing I want to talk about is the 4-piece tenacity set. It just doesn't work because the firewall that he does is burst damage and not elemental skill damage, even though the shield itself is a skill, so you won't get the 4-piece tenacity effect. A lot of people ask if retracing Bolide is good on him, and it only works on the character that actually has the set on them, so the shield will lose the 35% shield strength when you swap off of Thoma, so for that reason, retracing Bolide is not the greatest. As for the Instructor set, when I was testing Instructor, I thought I had just found the meta set for Thoma because it could give teams a bunch of elemental mastery just for using his burst, but unfortunately the effective Instructor can't be triggered while the character is off the field. So essentially you would have to bring Thoma onto the field for the reaction to occur to give an 8-second buff, and keep repeating that every time the buff drops, which would take away from your main DPS and supports field time, and ultimately ruin the rotation. So Instructor doesn't work. And finally, 4-piece Crimson Witch is less useful on him because you could only get the extra pyro damage bonus once every 15 seconds or so. It's still okay for reactions, but his internal cooldown makes his reactions pretty slow, so for that reason I don't suggest 4-piece Crimson Witch on him. If you've sat through the video long enough to get here, I commend you. Thank you so much for watching this far. Now we're going to talk about an easy build and a pretty advanced build. The easy build is a shield bot build. Because Thoma's shield refreshes pretty often, if you can get him to have a high base HP to start with, then your shield can feel relatively unbreakable. Even though it's pretty weak, because you're constantly refreshing, it'll be really good. For this build, you do want uptime on his elemental burst, so you're going to run 2-piece Emblem of Severed Fate and 2-piece Tenacity, which will give you 20 energy recharge and 20% HP bonus. And for stats, you're going to want to run an energy recharge Sands, an HP Goblet, and an HP Circlet. His damage output with this build isn't the greatest. He does get a little bit of damage bonus from HP, but by running Shield Bot, you're basically acknowledging that, no, I just don't want to take damage, and that's okay. For substats, you want to focus on energy recharge as much as possible, because ideally with Thoma, you're running a Pyro carry, and then Thoma is just the support to that carry that gives Pyro resonance, which ultimately means he won't have a battery, so he's got a battery himself. If you have enough energy recharge substats to get about 210 total, then you could totally build Black Tassel or a DPS weapon or something of the sort. However, like I said, uptime is the most important thing, so you want to make sure that you pick a weapon from the list that we talked about before that will get you to 210 energy recharge if you don't have it on your substats. Outside of energy recharge, having something like elemental mastery, HP, and attack are all good substats on a shield bot build. Alternatively, you can run 4-piece Noblesse to make him buff the rest of your team if that's something you want to do. If you don't already have a Noblesse buffer, that is another option. So the reason I split up the build section is because it's about to get really complicated. If you build Thoma to shield effectively, you can run into issues with damage being very low. If you build Thoma to deal better damage, you have to sacrifice either his shield strength or energy recharge stat. And if you sacrifice his energy recharge stat, you can't have shield uptime. Because we found ourselves in this confusing triangle, I spent weeks, I mean literal weeks, trying to figure out the best way to run Thoma. I enlisted some friends to help out as well, and thanks to low priority, there are sheets now to calculate energy recharge thresholds, Thoma damage, and more. And with all of these numbers flying around, we finally figured out how to balance out Thoma stats to get good damage, good shield, and good energy recharge. Of course, whether or not this works for you will be more dependent on your substats than anything, but I know you've been farming Emblem of Severed Fate for 2 patches now, so it should be fine. We came to the conclusion that 4 to 5k shield per second was a good rate, assuming that a monster is only pummeling you once every 3 seconds or so, or that you dodge at least a little bit. At Thoma level 80, talent level 8, to get a 4k shield you need roughly 23,000 HP, which would be an HP Sands plus some HP substats. Without Favonius Lance or Constellation 4, you will need at least 208 energy recharge, and of course to maximize damage, you want a decent crit ratio of 1 to 2 crit rate to crit damage. However, if you do have Constellation 4 and or Favonius Lance, you would need much less energy recharge. With Favonius Lance, you need 177%, with Constellation 4, you need 170%, and with both, you need 140% ER. But higher is comfier as always. With all that being said, it does not matter how you get those stats, it's just that you have them, which is important, which is why I wanted to talk to you guys about weapons beforehand. If you need to run an HP weapon with an ER Sands to make it happen, do it. For artifact sets, Emblem of Severed Fate is just the best. For myself to get these numbers, I built HP on my Sands, attack on my Goblet, and crit damage on my Circlet because I don't have a crit rate one. You can replace the attack Goblet with a pyro damage Goblet if you have one. The difference in damage is pretty negligible. And because we're using an HP Sands, you can actually swap that out for an attack Sands with an HP Goblet instead, and it'll get the same effect. Now, I did say 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate. You can run Crimson Witch Noblesse if you have the stats for it, but Emblem will likely be a higher damage just due to the energy requirements that Thoma has by default. And if you don't have a Noblesse holder, you can also use 4 Noblesse on Thoma as well. And I cannot stress this enough though, having burst up is the most important thing for Thoma, so if your damage has to suck for you to make sure that you always have burst, do it. And remember, the shield bot build that we talked about before this one is actually okay too. Make sure to go back and rewatch this section if you have any confusion. So now that we've talked about sets and weapons, we can talk about teams, which is a really important thing for Thoma because, to be honest, he's a little restricted. Of course, you could run him kind of wherever you want, but if you're looking to clear Spiral Abyss with him and make him a very valuable support, you'll want to run him specifically with a pyro carry like Hu Tao or Yoimiya. Under the right conditions, a Hu Tao team with Thoma can actually be really solid. Many of you know already that Thoma can steal vaporizes from Hu Tao, which can lower your team's damage overall. However, if you have C6 Xingqiu, it is extremely rare for Thoma to steal a vape from Hu Tao. For that reason, if you do have C6 Xingqiu, I highly recommend this team with Hu Tao, Thoma, Xingqiu, and Sucrose. Sucrose can run Viridescent Venerer, so you'll be able to swirl Pyro in the second rotation, which will buff your Thoma and your Hu Tao damage. And you can also give Sucrose Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers and swap to Xingqiu, so that Xingqiu gets a 48% attack boost at R5. Overall, the team is super strong, and it makes sense that Thoma's on the Hu Tao banner for reasons like this, especially with his Constellation 6. The next team I want to talk about is an Overload-based team, which is going to feature Yoimiya, Fischl, Thoma, and Jean or Sayu. Now I say or Sayu because Jean and Sayu functionally do the same things in the support role. The major difference would be that Jean can yeet people and does a lot more damage, but Sayu can still use 4-piece Viridescent to swirl Pyro, which will help with the overload damage and with Thoma and Yoimiya's Pyro damage as well. In addition to that, because Thoma's wall is kind of a projectile that moves a little bit slower than Yoimiya's arrows, a lot of the time Thoma will actually be the one proccing reactions in this team. For that reason, you can actually use Elemental Mastery on Thoma if you want to, as a bonus stat if you were using Content Cross or something like that, and it will increase your overload damage by a fair bit. It's really up to you though. I don't know if it's worth farming an entire set to get Elemental Mastery on it, but overall I really like this team because you can open up with a Yoimiya burst, switch to Thoma, use Thoma's skill and Elemental Burst, switch to Sayu, swirl some Pyro, switch to Beto, use her burst, and just farm overload and Pyro damage. It's so free. If you're not the Giga Chad overload enjoyer though, I do have another team for you featuring Child, Bennett, Thoma, and Sucrose. To make it clear, this team won't be as good as using Xiangling instead of Thoma in it. In fact, it'll lose a ton of damage, but it could still be kind of decent. Essentially, Child will be the aura, and every 2.5 seconds, Thoma is going to vaporize his damage, which will give him a boost on the DPS meter. You can use Sucrose to swirl and Bennett to buff Thoma as well, and overall the team just has similar synergy to Xiangling because Thoma's burst cost and cooldown are the same as Xiangling's unless you have Constellations, so it can fit in the rotation in a similar way. I know it sucks that I don't have any completely free to play teams to choose from here, but the problem is that Thoma is kind of niche. If you're trying to build Thoma optimally, you want to use him in these compositions because if you use him with someone like Yanfei or Diluc, he could steal vaporizes very easily. That being said, don't let that stop you from building Thoma if you want to use him in a team of characters that you like. As far as Overworld goes, you can just play him however. It's more of if you want to clear Spiral Abyss with 9 stars and you want to use Thoma to do it, some of your best options are going to be those teams that I just mentioned. Another thing I want to mention is that if you have Thoma's C6, he actually has an insane synergy with Xiao to increase plunge damage. MiHoYo has been super careful about putting plunge buffs in the game because they know that any plunge buffs can be a buff to Xiao, which is why Shimenawa takes the 15 energy at the start of a rotation. Because of the tech that people use to do one normal attack before they plunging attack, you'll be able to activate his shield refresh and get a buff on all of your plunging attacks for 15% more damage, and overall it can just be very strong if you're using someone like Bennett and Sayu and you're using Sayu to swirl. You'll definitely see some nice numbers. So now that we've talked about all of the information pertaining to Thoma, I want to show you guys a Spiral Abyss showcase that I was working on stream, but then the servers decided to shit the bed. But here is a clear of 12-3 using Yoimiya, Fischl, Thoma, and Jean.
Supporting fire! Don't get too close! Here come the fireworks! Midnight Phantasmagoria! Here's Becca! Fire it up! Time for a light show! Don't get too close!
Wind, hear me.
I got you covered!
Coalition down! Firehead!
As you wish, main Fräulein. Here's Becca!
So now that I've played Thoma for a fair bit, and actually, to be honest with you guys, I actually had been playing him before he released, here's my review of Thoma. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, Thoma provides something unique that we haven't seen before, which is shield over time. Though his shield may not be as strong as Diona's, or Noelle's, or Zhongli's, it has the ability to repeatedly protect us and keep essentially regenerating and becoming stronger the longer that it's in play. Because of this, when you're playing Thoma with characters that are able to dodge, and you combine a couple dodges with some shield stacking, you actually end up with a shield that's as strong as Noelle's Devotion. While the first couple shields are made of paper, the longer he's in play, the better they get. And as a result, I think we have a character here that could be useful now and in the future with new synergies releasing. Does that mean you need to invest into him now? Not really. If you already have good shield units, you don't necessarily need Thoma to be leveled up, but I will say he's actually a decent unit. I don't think he's broken, but he's definitely not as bad as a lot of creators are saying he is. The worst part about him right now is that he just doesn't fit into a lot of teams, but I think because of how unique his shield is, it's very possible and highly likely we'll see him in some top teams in the future. Another question that a lot of people have though is Thoma free-to-play friendly? His best weapons are not free-to-play accessible, unfortunately, and while there are decent options for free-to-play players, it does feel like Thoma needs a lot of investment to be on par with a lot of the other shield characters that we have in the game. Another issue is, as I mentioned before, his best synergies are with 5-star characters, and there aren't a lot of synergies. Because of that, if you don't have any of these synergies, I can't recommend building him unless you just really like the character. And the last part of the free-to-play question is, do I need his constellations? And while you don't need them to play him, I was playing him at C0 in the showcase. They are a massive quality of life change, and they make him infinitely better. Overall, I do think that Thoma is a wonderful unit and an excellent addition to the game as the first pyro shielder that's not Yanfei, but his uses are really niche right now, so if you're not building a Hu Tao team, if you're not building Yoimiya team, if you don't have C6 and aren't building a Xiao team, then you don't necessarily need to level up Thoma. But you do you, it's a PvE game. Hey, thanks for watching this guide. I appreciate all the support you guys have been giving me on the last couple. If you could hit that subscribe button and like the video if you've enjoyed, it goes a long way. Thank you guys again so much for watching. Make sure to follow on Twitch if you want to see live content, and I'll see you guys next time.